our next innovation expert speaks on building a logical data layer for secure, compliant, and high-velocity GenAI. Here to help you unlock AI's full potential within your organizations, please give a warm welcome to Senior Data and AI Evangelist, Denodo Technologies, Terry Dorsey.
Hello, everyone. It's really good to be here. As was mentioned, I'm going to talk about engineering AI governance at scale, about how we leverage a logical data fabric, layers, and all that stuff in order to actually do that. Very long title. And so the first thing that I want to talk about is, and I think this theme has been resonating throughout the conference and many of the sessions that I've seen before, or earlier, and it's this idea of modernization and what phase we are now in with it. I mean, I recall cloud movement starting as far back as 2019 and moving forward. So we're moving to the cloud, we've got our lake houses, and this modernization effort originally was designed around the big data and analytics phase. But then we're in this space where now AI has become really prevalent on our minds and within organizations. And we find that it changes the dynamic. It changes how we look at architecture and how we look at moving forward, and then this concept of actually how do we scale. So the question becomes, can we scale AI across the enterprise in a way that is cost-effective, governed, secure, all of these things that are very critical for production-level implementations. And the challenge is controlling how we do it, cost, the complexity, and all the risks as far as that come along with this delivery. And I'm going to refer back to, I'm not sure if Alexandra Flatt is here today, but her presentation yesterday I thought was really good. It resonated with me because it was some of the same experiences that I went through back in 2017, 2018 timeframe. And so when we look at the space we have today, we see all of this running towards AI, more specifically generative AI, because if we think about it, traditional AI has been around for a while. But when we look at these two technologies together and all of the things that have to happen in order to lift them up, there's this idea of scaling, being able to do it to get business outcomes, but be able to do it with predictable cost, predictable risk, delivery, as well as to be able to have these consistent business outcomes within our organization. So that's kind of how I think about scaling today. And when we think about the way a lot of AI projects are initiated, and as far as I'm concerned, this goes back to a lot of the analytics projects back in the day, is there's a technical organization that's given the responsibility for the execution of these projects. And this means that all of the things that have to be done within those projects are lumped in to these specific projects. And we've seen it with analytics, where we've ended up with all this sprawl around analytics, and we're very quickly moving in that direction when it comes to AI and specifically generative AI. And so these projects now have to cover all the things, the development, the orchestration, the business, the governance. And so these silos happen, and this creates even more complexity and risk within our organizations. And so when we think about that, what that means from a cost perspective is that we incur that cost for every project that we initiate on. And for many customers I talk to, we've seen this repeat itself over and over again within the analytics space, and it's really rapidly moving into the generative AI space and particularly the agentic space, this idea of sprawl and cost. And from my experience and from my observation, it's a lot to do with how we actually approach these types of projects, and frankly, any type of project within our organization. A lot of times that onus does not sit within the technical organization. It's a matter of determining how many capabilities are actually involved in that process. So because when we think about execution of AI as a single capability, what happens is governance fragments because you get different implementations of it based off of different projects. Again, we saw it with analytics, and sometimes we even see it in transformation and other implementations within organizations. Business meaning becomes fragmented as well, because we have all these different approaches to this information. And I think the theme, and I think the previous speaker as well, talks about how we now have this collaboration across the organization in order to facilitate success, but also scale. So this idea of data access patterns, all these different things being divergent in the organization, fundamentally, they rely on the interaction of different capabilities within the organization. Data architecture, discipline by design, so this idea of design principles of separation, concern, and scope, and all these things come to mind when I think about this. And so when we think about the capabilities that uplift artificial intelligence, and artificial intelligence can be looked at as a capability, but it's a matter of putting scope and guardrails around what that capability actually entails. And what that also happens to do is it allows the organizations to focus, or people that are in that capability space, to focus on the delivery of AI development, orchestration, managing models, developing models, looking at technology, bringing more technology in specific to that particular capability. And when we start to interact that capability with capabilities that are on the business side, and there are many different capabilities on the business side. I mean, Alexander talked about working with clinical capability, and my organization was product development or supply chain. And these are and capabilities that exist within those parts of the organization. And that's a matter of trying to focus of how we now implement AI and the output from AI into those business processes. And the idea that each of these things can scale independently. You can get more AI technology and frameworks brought in, but the business can adopt and adjust how they actually have to implement or ready themselves between those different capabilities. And one major capability for that, and I think this has resonated in many of the discussions, is this idea of data and information delivery. Now, when we think back on the warehouse days, big data days, and even the AI days, every organization, many organizations that operate projects, data delivery and information is also embedded in each of those projects. And a lot of times what happens is, and I think this is the same chaos that the previous speaker referred to, is we build this debt because we operate or we execute within these project boundaries, and there's not enough sharing and collaboration across the organization. So when we think about it from an architecture perspective in terms of the capabilities and what those capabilities maintain or control, we can kind of get an idea of how they can scale, and thus the organization as a whole can scale. Along with this idea of these capabilities is where governance fits into that. And I've seen many philosophies around the level of governance. And so from my experience, and I can infer some of it from some of the previous speakers that I heard earlier, is that governance is an enterprise directive. The policies, security, risk, those are things that belong to the enterprise. For example, when we were executing on our AI project, we had intellectual property that belonged to our customers. Well, from an enterprise perspective, that means that there are directives as to how that information or any information should be treated. It wasn't specific to AI, it wasn't specific to particular business capabilities. It was organization or enterprise-wide. And so there's this idea of the enterprise setting policies and directives and the capabilities within those organizations executing on those. Example of that is when I think about the firewalls or things that are around the intellectual property, when it comes to data delivery, that means that data delivery has to align to those governance perspectives. If I have business processes or capabilities, they have to align. So everybody has to align to this enterprise-wide, and this concept around how you execute means that you have more cohesiveness into how governance is actually implemented within the organization. And also how things scale. So when we worked, we had the business capability of product development working alongside the capability of AI orchestration and development, working along the side of infrastructure, of working alongside with information and data delivery, all collaborating based off of enterprise guidelines of how we were supposed to operate with it for that particular project. And it scaled really well, it worked really well, because now we were all communicating under the same guidelines. And so that kind of looked like, from a governance standpoint, with ours as the firewall. So when models were built, that had to be kept in mind. So how many models you had to create was going to be based off of what your policies were around firewalls. How your data was actually going to be delivered against those same policies. You get the picture from there. And so when we look at many of the statistics that have been shown on the screens earlier, is this idea of why projects, particularly AI projects, and I would say even AI, if we look at analytics and even governance, a lot of governance objectives are failing. And fundamentally, there's this idea of governance versus the operational or the industrialization of part of these capabilities subject to governance. And the biggest, or the area of failure, and I think this is also a prevalent concept, is that data and information delivery is the biggest component of that failure. And I would submit that a lot of times it's strongly due to the way that we actually execute on projects. And there's this idea, if we look at it as a wholesale capability, there are ways to get advantages and scale from being able to do that. And so what happens when we start to look at information and data delivery specifically as its own capability? And we find that you can lower costs because you don't duplicate, reuse now. We build components and things that are reused. Governance is built into those, aligned to the enterprise idea of what those things are. Delivery is faster. In some instances, no development's necessary because those artifacts exist. For example, if I am working on a project in our case, artificial intelligence project, I have a concept of, in our case, a formula and all of the policies and governance around how it should be protected. Once I create that, I can use it for many capabilities, like AI. I can use it for integration. I can use it for reporting. And I can know that all of the governance, all of the trust and quality is built into that representation or that implementation of it. I shouldn't have to recreate it every time I have to do some type of project within the organization. In the case of AI, it becomes even stronger because now I have this single point of access and control and audit around those particular assets that I create. But from a cost and delivery perspective, this consistency of governance, this faster delivery, this ability to manage what things are actually distributed to or presented to the organization becomes very powerful. And it is a very strong component in the sustainability of projects, which translates, in my experience, to scale. So, for example, we were able to create projects for, when things came in for AI, we could create data and delivery products. If something came in from another area of the organization that needed information, we could either reuse or extend or create, but it all has to be governed within that same capability within the organization. So the next question becomes, how do we now industrialize data and information delivery? And this is where, my preference and practitioner for quite a while, 40 some years in my experience, and also in the specific implementation that I led, there's this idea of leveraging the design principle of extraction. And that's where logical data management has its foundations. This idea of, if I abstract components of my enterprise, and then I can deliver on those abstractions, then that means that I can provide sustainability, the governance, and trust on those objects that are reused by everyone in the enterprise. There was a really good statement that I think Alexandra said yesterday, that trust begins when people in the business have access to that information. And traditionally, when we approach AI analytics and, in some instances, AI projects, a lot of times the actual business community is kept separate from that effort. But when we look at it as this collaboration of capabilities, in our case, the business was embedded in that project, and so they had a stake in looking at that information, comparing it to the actual business processes that they were executing on, and they had the ability to do that within guardrails and also have some type of input into what they could do to improve their business processes as well as align the information from their processes into what was actually feeding that AI. And that was done through the creation of products so that they could instill that trust. And once the business understood or accepted what was actually representative of their business processes, that means reuse at scale becomes something that's really achievable because it has its foundational components based off of that validation and activity. And so I look at logical data management as this architectural boundary between what's happening in the organization as far as systems moving in and out and processes changing, and being able to encapsulate that and present it out at an enterprise level. And so now it becomes this idea of shared meaning of foundational things that are within our enterprise. And so, for example, for us, a formulation is a formulation. A customer is a customer. A customer has attributes. A customer looks a certain way. Formulas look a certain way. Formulas are secured a certain way. Sales, accounting journals. We can think about these things in our enterprise that we can now create these abstractions of and deploy out into the enterprise for use across the enterprise, AI being one of those. The ability for the business to be able to interact with the product of data that they actually produce through their business processes becomes very powerful. People become more data literate. People become more innovative, more creative. Projects, when you start the cycle of AI, which is it's a never-ending iterative cycle, people become more creative because now there's this power of I can actually get information, move it in, and reflect what's happening in my organization and embed it within my organization. So we have this one shared meaning of these things that are in the enterprise. We can now create metrics and KPIs based off of those, but we have this fundamental meaning of things and the trust that can be instilled in those based off of the validation. We have one governance access model of how that information is governed, and that can be offloaded or designated to a team or capability that can make sure that these objects are governed with the proper enterprise-wide policies and securities around them. And this one point of access of information into the organization, which means that you have total visibility and transparency into how information is being leveraged by who, and in many cases for what activities. So it becomes very powerful and very fundamental when you think about it from a scaling perspective. And so when we look at this boundary of this logical abstraction layer, we see that there's this ability to connect to the organization. And all of our modernization efforts around lakehouses, warehouses, new systems, SaaS systems, or whatever, these now become pretty much the raw products of things that are now being able for us to articulate and make these abstractions of our enterprise. So unstructured information, as well as that structured. And traditionally, this is where most organizations have focused on how they actually produce information to be consumed for these downstream types of products. And so now when we think about this other side of the architectural boundary, we can now start to create what our organization or how people are going to interact with that organization so we can have conversations around products of the organization. So typically, if I talk to a business person, I ask them, well, how do you determine whether we've shorted someone? They don't go in and say that, table, KNA1 or whatever. They go in and say that, I look at my deliveries, and I look at what's sold, and I look at, what I'm actually putting on a truck. There is this language of things that are abstractions of the enterprise where everybody has this common way of communicating. And that's how we were able to execute on our AI project as well. We have the business, we have external resources, and we have these conversations around how do we now translate these components of our enterprise into things that can be captured or quantified and able to use for AI, right? And so this side of it means that we can be very designful and mindful of what things we're actually employing, what those attributes are, and how they can be used downstream. And those things can be developed on the side of the, despite where information is sourced within the information. So now I'm in the product of saying, I can now abstract my enterprise, and I can deliver it, in a way that is secure and governed, because now I can create these artifacts, and I can now govern them based off of the policies within my organization. I can align the attributes that I give these things to my identity providers, so that identities that come in that leverage that information, they also are restricted and bound by the policies that I've now put in place. And this goes for agentic agents as well, in the space of them having identities within the organization. One thing that we thought was very powerful was this idea of we could re-leverage them for services and APIs, and what happens is the executor is still constrained by the policies of the organization. One object satisfied for the entire part of the organization with the proper governance built into it and the proper attributes delivered, right? And so these ideas being able to generalize and be able to extract become very powerful and very fundamental to being able to scale. And not just for AI, for any consumer within the organization. I think that one of the panel discussions yesterday was about how do you architect for something that you don't know what it's going to be like 5 years from now? And I would maintain that that has to do with the separating of these concerns or these capabilities. Looking at information and data delivery as a capability and concern, if I have this idea of an agnostic consumer, then that means that I can build my governance and my attributes and policies, and the consumer will abide by those. And so as new technology comes about, the access for information doesn't really change. I can shift it within the bounds of my fabric or of my logical data management layer, and I can adapt quickly as rules change. But the attributes and those policies don't really change as often as the systems and the use cases that are downstream within my organization. And so that becomes very, very powerful for scaling. Many people, when they talk about data products or data management, there's this idea of how do I now use or leverage LLMs or generative AI in that space. And there's the opportunity to do that as well, as far as how do I describe things? How do I model things? What are some industry standards about how things look at? This idea of being able to leverage AI to do that is very powerful as well. And so now there's this idea of I can build and I can do it. I can have capabilities within my organizations, capabilities around governance, capabilities around the creation of this abstraction of the enterprise and products that are built on top of that. And now I can deploy them for regular use cases like reporting and analytics. But I can also now present them to the broader organization so that they can do validation or ad hoc projects or other efforts to meet goals. I mean, we had people that were using it for financial planning, for demand planning, for automation, because now we're operating off of this idea of the enterprise that is now available for the organization as a whole. And so this naturally extends to AI agents as well, right? And so I've heard there were other presentations that spoke of MCP, right? MCP is a technical technology, but now imagine this consistent interface over MCP to the whole of the enterprise with the security and the governance embedded around that. And so now I have this place to manage how I'm delivering to the enterprise in this place that provides that stability. So one point to mention is we started in 2017, 2018 we delivered, 2019 we had products that were created from AI. But in the space of that time, there was a cloud migration, I think that started about 2018, 2019, an ERP migration, and many systems that were moving in and out as a result of a digital transformation. And the stability of that effort remained because we were building off an abstraction layer. We weren't building off of the concrete components of our enterprise. And so, to wrap up here, I would say that the principles around scaling, and this is for many efforts because many organizations are not, I mean, everybody's investing in AI, but many organizations still have these challenges around how do I get information? How do I make my organization data-centric or data-minded? And so this idea of scaling has to do with this idea of breaking up the responsibilities around things so that people can focus within the capability guidelines. AI development being one of those, and not give them the onus of security and modeling and all these other things. Leverage other capabilities and the interactions across these capabilities in order to do that, in mind that each of these capabilities have insight or sight into what the governance policies are in the organization, so they can be held accountable to implement those. When we abstract information and information delivery, we empower the organization as well. We can move very quickly, and a lot of our development time, particularly in the data space, decreases significantly. And that these interactions between these capabilities, they can be intentional and governed, but very critical. I mean, there's a lot of conversation around cross-functional collaboration, but when it comes to many projects, it has to do with how am I implementing it within a specific capability. And those capabilities, when those capabilities collaborate together, then that's when we have this ability to scale, and each of these capabilities also have this independence to be able to create value within their capability part of the organization. And that in order to scale, it is a matter of reusing things that the output or outcomes of these capabilities that are within the organization. And so AI itself scales when we establish these enterprise capabilities and they deliver information, specifically the capability of data and information delivery as a separate capability within the organization, enforcing governance directives so that new initiatives, despite whether shifts in technology, can still be adopted quickly at lower cost and carry less risk. Thank you. If there are any questions, you can talk to us at our booth outside in the exhibition hall.
Amazing. Thank you so much. We don't have time for questions, but maybe, you know what? We might be able to get one question out. So does anyone have a question out here?
Cool.
Yes? No?
Thank you.
OK, well, thank you so much. It was a great presentation.
Thank you.